Hi and welcome. What you see here is a tray full of red wiggler worms. And red wiggler worms are famous for their ability to break down organic matter and create some really great compost that your plants in your garden would really like. So it's kind of a win-win. It's a great place to put your compostable kitchen scraps and trash rather than dumping it into the everyday garbage. And then the finished product is also something that you can turn around and feed to your plants. Here we have a little worm that decided he's going to go exploring within the plastic bag. Once in a while I see that happening, but not very often. So I just figured I'd fish that little guy out of there. Besides red wigglers, I've got other breeds of worms too. A couple different varieties of night crawlers. But the red wigglers are the worms that I have in the greatest numbers within my wormery here. The castings on this piece of paper are piling up pretty nicely. The ones on the bottom I don't think really don't count so much because they just stuck on there anyway. But the ones that piled up on the top of the paper are the ones that were most recently deposited over the course of the past week or so since we last fed this bin. And in the case of this bin, it has been exactly 7 days since the last feeding. And the last feeding occurred over there where that piece of paper is to indicate to me where I last fed. For the past, I don't know how many feedings, let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back to the starting point, 5. So over the past 5 feedings, roughly on a weekly interval, I believe, I've been feeding this bin in a pocket feeding sort of style, which is what they call it. Usually in the past I had always just fed down the middle, but I figured I would try something a little different and adopt this pocket feeding approach. I've got a whole bunch of these circular coffee filters, so I think I'm going to upgrade the feeding zone indicator with a brand new one when we feed. And this time we're going to be feeding here because I've been going in a clockwise fashion pattern. So here's the filter that we'll use to mark where we last fed, and that'll be right here when we get done. It's pretty interesting. Other than that piece of paper that was there, there's not much other indications of the fact that that's where we had last fed. In the previous check-ins on these pocket feeding patterns, I've always found that it wasn't always the most recent feeding where we found the most worms. It was sometimes going back 2 feedings prior or even older where we would see the greatest number of worms. Kind of makes sense because the stuff in those older pockets has had a greater amount of time for the food to really break down thoroughly. And that really heavily broken down stuff is what the worms really like. Let's see. I always like to probe around a little bit before feeding just to see how previous feedings are progressing. So why don't we do that really quick? And we'll go back like a time machine, right? We'll go back 1 week to see how the feeding that was applied a week ago down in this corner is progressing. I guess my first reaction is that the moisture level in here is quite high. The material is very damp, and that's really what the worms like, so I don't mind keeping it that way. It's later on when I know that I'm going to be wanting to steer the bin towards harvest that I'll try to allow some of this moisture in the bin to evaporate. But for now, I'm keeping the plastic coverings on. It's the plastic coverings that obviously keep the moisture in the bin. That's a pretty densely populated feeding area. They're really working down that last feeding, aren't they? These feedings have been placed into the bin with a little bit of supplementary bedding and another type of coffee filter. The one that I'm using most recently is these ones that are kind of cone shaped, so I'm not really able to clean them off and flatten them out the way I used to be able to with these style ones. So I tend to just use them up because they occupy more space in that conical shape. While I was poking around, I could feel this hard object down low. It's a little peach pit. I really don't know what to expect from this, but I got a sense that it's not going to be making much progress between now and the time that this bin is ready for harvest. And I mean, at the age now of 105 days, and with this being its 19th feeding, I believe I might be steering this thing towards harvest pretty soon. And for me, harvesting the bin most often consists of getting the worms to just bug out of the material themselves so that I can harvest the castings without much effort. And I do that by, first starving the bin for a while, letting the worms kind of poke through the material and pick out whatever they can as far as leftovers go. Leftover pieces of food, leftover chunks of bedding. And then I'll treat them to a nice freshly built feeding area on one of the edges of the bin. And then they'll all be drawn into that newly created feeding area, pretty much just abandoning their compost all on their own, making it super easy to harvest. So if things go as hoped, I'll probably be doing that in this bin as well at some point soon. So that was pretty interesting. Really heavily populated last feeding area. This feeding area that I'm poking down into now goes back 2 feedings. My feeding intervals are roughly a week, so I can also estimate the time frame as having been about 2 weeks ago. This is the stem of a banana. I'm not sure if that's really indicative of 2 weeks of progress or if that just ended up in there. In 2 weeks, I would normally not expect to see a banana stem this far gone yet. So I might have actually found it around and just dumped it in there. It may have been in the bin longer. Here I'm not really seeing many signs of previous feedings. Now I'm kind of bumping into something a little larger here. This might actually be another banana stem, another fairly, heavily broken down item. And this looks like some paper, little scraps of bedding. But as I comb through this stuff, here and there I'm finding a couple other things. This might be a banana peel. It's like paper thin anymore. You can kind of see its fibrous appearance, and it'll be gone pretty soon. Just this very end of it, this looks like the opposite end of where the stem is, this little flower portion. That part of it is a little tougher and it seems to be taking longer to break down. But I got a feeling like another week or so from now, that banana peel is going to be hardly recognizable, if it's even intact anymore, if it doesn't fall apart into little pieces. So I gotta say, for 2 weeks ago, that feeding really got gobbled up pretty quickly. I really don't expect to see much of that in another week or so. Possibly a little trace of banana stem or something. I don't know what this is. This is the stem of something too, but it just shattered in my hands. I usually take care not to break stuff up too much by my hands, because I really like to prefer, I really prefer observing how the material breaks down as a result of the worms and all the other creatures in the bin taking care of it for me. But sometimes I'll just shatter stuff and break it into little bits. All right, it's turning into a grand tour, but as we continue back to check the previous feeding from 3 feedings ago, now we're going back yet another week or so in time. Here's a little stem of some sort of a veggie. This, I believe, is also a banana stem. You could tell I'm feeding a fair number of banana peels. And usually the peels themselves are gone. It's just the stems that remain. Here's another peach pit, similarly very tough still. It was just recently that I started adding stuff like peach pits to my feedings to see how the worms handle it. Every now and then I like to run an experimental type object through my worm bins to see how the worms deal with it. I'm not too surprised to see that they're hardly making any progress with it. Little stuff like this, sticks, whatever, chances are that those are not going to get broken down either by the time it, harvest of the bin comes around. So here too, we're seeing a great deal of progress on the materials. It's just the tougher, harder type objects are still somewhat intact, but for the most part, it's just a bunch of finished castings. Here too, another chunk of something. In this case, I think it's part of the outer husk of a mango seed. And the only reason I could tell is because of the way it's the outer edge here, and 2 parts of the husk. Otherwise, I don't think I'd be able to distinguish that from maybe an avocado peel or something like that. So those are the slightly tougher types of objects that might take a little longer in the bin, but they're all making nice progress. Okay. I really didn't think I was going to take quite so much time poking around, checking out the previous feedings. But we've now had a chance to check out the 3 previous feedings, leading us to the 4th previous feeding, which would put us back about a month ago. And it just happens to be where we're going to be feeding today as we continue in this circular pattern around the bin. So we're going to open up a hole, but this time we're not just opening up the hole to see how the feeding from 4 feedings ago is coming along, but we're also going to be placing today's feeding in there. Even though there's been a lot of additional food placed elsewhere in the bin, you can still see there's a good number of worms hanging out here. Probably means that the material in here still has not been completely depleted of edible stuff. And lo and behold, another peach pit. 3 of them already in this bin. I knew I had bins with those in them, but I didn't think I had, 3 of them in any one bin. There's a lot of worms hanging out here, that's for sure. This might be that bin of mine that I thought was possibly the most heavily populated bin. And I believe I've even gone ahead and launched a new bin by recruiting volunteer worms from this container to get that new bin started. But regardless, there's still a good number of worms still hanging out in this bin. And even here in this corner where we're going to feed, there's a good number of worms too. So let's go ahead and proceed with the addition of the food. And we can move on to the next container. So I've got my typical assortment of small particles of kitchen scraps, and what we're going to be placing it into is a coffee filter. Pretty much my standard mode of operating. It's banana stems, bits and pieces of potato peel, maybe the end of a head of lettuce. Pretty normal, average feeding. And since this is the older of the bins, this could be one of the last times I add fresh bedding, because the bedding bits, you know, just like some of the tougher food items, take a little while to break down at times in certain bins. So I wouldn't want big chunks of uneaten paper to become the reason I can't harvest a bin. So I might just start adding food only to my future feedings. And then I'll have like that sense that maybe what I've put in here has a good chance of actually breaking down in time for the harvest of the container. But you know, stuff like those peach pits and whatnot, sticks, things that are not going to break down in that amount of time, I can just fish all those out at some point and move them over into a younger bin where they've got a chance of actually breaking down with the additional time they need. So we'll throw that peach pit back where we found it in that corner. I don't know what else. There was a stick. I don't know what else we found in here. Here's half of an avocado pit. Usually an avocado pit that's been around for a while can, get broken. But if you were to try to do so with a freshly removed pit that just came right out of the fruit, you're not going to be able to shatter it like that. It takes a little bit of time for it to get broken down, and then you can expect to see it breaking down. Lately I've been actually slicing those things, cutting them into little thin pieces. I may have even included some of them in this feeding here. I fished out a piece just to show you that the thing can actually get sliced. So I got a feeling by being in a much smaller form like that, it has a much greater chance of getting broken down than if it goes in whole, like a marble, or like a pinball, or whatever you want to refer to it as. All right, geez. I feel like I've taken so much time feeding this one bin. And I think it's just because I can't seem to resist. Can't seem to resist the fun of poking around within my worm bins. And at this point, this is my oldest active red wiggler worm bin. Oh geez, I was going to use this as additional bedding in today's feeding. So I just feel like if I'm not yet fully covered up, I can always still sort of go backpedal a little bit to make up for missed steps. So here too, we'll just go ahead and we'll dump in that old feeding zone indicator coffee filter and include it with today's feeding as additional bedding material. And then this bin will get a nice fresh coffee filter to show us where we last fed. All right, we're going to cover up here and continue on to our next bin. Just try to carefully put everything back here so I don't end up with all kinds of castings flying around all over the place, making a big mess. Okay, onward. Okay, so now my next oldest bin is, I believe, 75 days old at this point. For this bin, it's going to be its 11th feeding. And in here, we've got a little bit of an assortment. It started out as being just red wigglers from another Vermicomposter's collection of worms. But I later found out that there's probably other types of worms mixed in here besides red wigglers. Specifically, it's thought that there's probably European night crawlers in here too, as well as African blue. I think they're called African blue. Or Indian blue? Indian blue. Indian blue worms. Alright, I've got a couple worms that I saw on the plastic. So this thing that you see here on top, I usually cover up with newspaper like what you saw in the previous bin, but here I decided I would take a chunk of this old, what the heck? I decided I would take a chunk of this old beach towel and use that as top covering. Here we've got a chunk of dead worm, I guess. Something I've seen here and there. I'm trying to remember if it was this bin. I think it was this bin where I was occasionally seeing segments of worms, just broken chunks of worm. So I was kind of hoping that that was the end of it. I hadn't seen it in a while, or at least I don't recall seeing it recently. But whatever's causing it is probably still going on. So this is my first try at using, wow, there's that big fat guy. Is that the big fat worm that I remember seeing once in the previous feeding? I think it might be. There's this one big fat worm, unusually fat compared to all the other worms, that I keep spotting from time to time, and I'm trying to remember. One of my viewers even gave it a cute little name. So I guess we could do the same in here. We could take a quick peek around to see how previous feedings are progressing, and then we can go ahead and add the next feeding. This is kind of unusual here. I could see little tiny mites walking around on this piece of paper, but there's also what appears to be some sort of a foreign type of a worm here. It's very white in color. Maybe a potworm, but I always thought potworms were a little bit smaller. This is some sort of big monster potworm. Like I said, this collection of worms in this particular system came from another vermicomposter with whom I did a trade. So I sent red wigglers. What I thought I was getting was red wigglers in exchange, but what's in here could actually be an assortment of various worm types. So what did we do previously? I think we just kind of went around and we decided we would check here first to see how a 1 week old feeding is progressing. Here I'm seeing a lot of stems of leaves. I believe that this pile of leaves might have been used to also indicate where the previous feedings had been. So besides placing a coffee filter on top of a feeding after finishing the feeding. I believe I was also using a little bit of supplementary bedding in the form of these dry leaves. This is another avocado pit, and it's interesting because it's just, it's kind of mushy, Some of them seem like they'll just want to break and shatter, but this one seems like it kind of has like almost a pasty sort of consistency. So whatever, I just, those are one of the sort of things that I do occasionally, try to see if I can bust it up just to see what it looks like. I don't want to go too far with that though. I'd prefer to see how the worms handle it in terms of doing away with it. So once in a while I'll just break one up a little bit, but look at that. I do seem to have a good number of, look at this too, it's, something about that end of the worm. It almost looked like there might have been, I don't think so, maybe not. I thought that worm might have been exhibiting signs of having broken. And that's one interesting too. It looked so stubby before, but now as it starts to try to get mobile, it just becomes so much longer. So maybe while they're just chilling out and hanging out, they kind of constrict themselves for whatever reason. And once they want to start moving, they'll stretch themselves out again. Maybe that's why I'm seeing some of them, in different sort of stubby configurations, if that's the right way to think about it, as opposed to some of them being in that elongated mode. This, I don't remember if this piece of avocado went in with last week's feeding. Doesn't seem like it's making a great deal of progress. Last week's feeding zone in the other bin that we just checked in on was really mobbed with worms. I was really kind of surprised. Here, down here at the bottom, I guess where all the juices kind of flow down to is where we're going to expect to see the worms. Yeah, there we go. Kind of open up one of these little food bundles and you can see them all in there. So they're doing a nice job breaking it all down. Here's a banana peel, much more recognizable. Still kind of connected over here on the flower end with multiple segments of it still in place. Still see some leftover grit in here too from the last go around. This, I think, is a chunk of apple. It's really hard to tell, you would think that if you had a piece of banana peel in your hand or a piece of apple in your hand, especially one that, is in this stage of this stage of decomposition, whatever, that it would have sort of a distinct odor, recognizable odor. And now that maybe because I was handling it, I can smell the apple scent a little bit, but it's kind of faint, hardly even recognizable. Kind of has that fermenting sort of smell. So that's kind of cool. Interesting to see how things are progressing. So since this bin is, I don't know how much, a little bit more than a month younger than the one we just fed. How much was it? 105 was the bin we just fed before. This one is the 75-day-old bin. Not surprising that it's got much more kind of a chunkier consistency, large bits of maybe food scraps, large chunks of bedding materials, much more recognizable stems of leaves everywhere. I'm sure we give this thing another month and a half, and it too gets over 100 days of age. It'll look a lot more advanced in terms of its progress of breaking down. But for now, I believe this is pretty normal for a bin that's roughly 2.5 months old. So down in this corner, similar story. The feedings, I've been trying to, maintain a certain degree of consistency in terms of the types of materials I feed with, as well as the amount that I feed each time. So it's typically kind of like that 2 handfuls approach with usually with a couple coffee filters as supplementary bedding, sort of a wrap for the food, and then occasionally grit. I don't always add the crushed pulverized eggshell as grit, and you might have saw me add that earlier. The grit is just kind of a food supplement that the worms actually need within their gizzards to break down the foods that they consume. Although some people will argue that they can get by without it. But if you've got it, what the heck? It's just another opportunity to compost something rather than just throw it in the trash. So I'll take all my old eggshells and collect them up until I've got a nice large amount of them, and then I'll run them through a little blender and crush them, and I've got grit. I remember running into this object a couple times in the past. It doesn't seem like it's really making a lot of progress. It always seems to kind of have that same appearance to it. Same size, same appearance, not a lot of worm activity, so it's one of the few things I'm recognizing in this feeding area. Everything else seems like it's been pretty much gobbled up. And here and there I see maybe a fragment of paper or something, but they're doing a nice job down in here, so that's pretty cool. What's this? Maybe paper, some leftover bedding bits. Okay, let's open up the spot where we're going to feed, and that should take us back to 4 feedings ago. See how it's progressing here. I don't really see much of anything recognizable other than the stems of leaves, little sticks, stuff like that. This feels like it might be the shell of something, or no, this is actually the little root of something. Well, you know, it makes sense. The root is usually, not the root, yeah, okay, the stem of some sort of little vegetable. And I guess I just broke it in half by handling it a little bit rough. Chances are it's not really going to survive. And at this point, if we come back in here to see how things are progressing, we're probably going to see a lot of the leftover foods from today's feeding, and we won't really be able to make sense of anything like that. Something that's broken down that far. Okay, so we've got ourselves a nice little hole, and we'll just use these last 2 coffee filters that I've got here to apply today's feeding. Here's another one of those cut up avocado pits. This is a little piece of sticker. Figured I'd remove that because that's not going to be a natural compostable material. It's probably some form of plastic or whatever. It's pretty small too, so I wouldn't want it to blend in with my compost. If I can get rid of it now, I will. Okay. A lot of this is avocado that's gone bad. Still has its outer shell attached to it. What else in here? Got some potato peelings and a piece of banana peel, whatever. Obviously tomato in here too. So, nice little assortment of food scraps for them to enjoy. And I've got a little bit of stuff on my hands here. Try to keep my ungloved hand clean so I can handle the camera and things that I don't want to have covered in compost. But sometimes I kind of mix it up a little bit there and get some stuff on my hand that I want to try to keep clean. Whatever, not too bad. So that was did I put the grit in? I'm trying to remember now. There it is. I think we did. Get so busy chit-chatting I forget what I did a minute ago. So the coffee on top I think is always a nice little topper. It's really hard to tell. It's hard to distinguish it from the castings themselves, so it's hard to tell if it's been all eaten or if there's leftovers, because it just seems to blend in. Although it does seem to have a slightly distinct appearance to it. So I believe for the most part it almost always just gets gobbled right up. So I don't worry about adding lots of coffee because it does seem like it always vanishes 1, 2, 3. All right, well, we're done feeding my 2 oldest active red wiggler worm bins. Even though this one is not strictly red wigglers only, it's kind of a hybrid bin. But since it is probably predominantly red wigglers, I just group it with the rest of my red wiggler bins and treat it appropriately or treat it similarly. Not that, you know, different breeds of worms need to be treated much differently. I just like to keep them separate if possible. And this is one case where that's obviously not possible. So I'm curious to see where this towel is going to lead. Usually I cover with paper, and the paper is something that the worms can gobble up pretty readily once it starts to get damp. This is a slightly thicker material, which probably will take a little longer to break down. I guess I'm curious to see how far it gets by the time this bin is ready for harvest, whether it's going to be even partially broken down yet, or if it's just going to end up moving with the worms into their new habitat when the worms are ready to be relocated. So I guess time will tell, and we'll see. All right, everyone. I've got a couple things I've got to put away and clean up, but I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. I'm going to sign off now, turn off the camera, but before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.